3 shapes moved through the tree line behind me, and none of them walked like anything that belonged on this planet. I counted them without turning my head. 1 on the left, low and wide. 1 in the middle, taller, moving in long, careful steps. 1 on the right, hanging back, watching instead of walking. A triangle. Hunters move in triangles. Deer don't. Wolves don't. Not anymore. Not the few that are left. I had been walking this stretch of dead ground for 6 years, and I knew every shape that belonged to it. These 3 did not belong to it. I kept walking. My boots crunched over broken concrete that used to be a parking lot, back when this town had a name and a power plant and people who worried about things like rent and whether their kids were eating enough vegetables. Now it had rust and weeds and me, and apparently 3 visitors who thought I hadn't noticed them yet. I had noticed them 11 minutes ago. The wind was coming from the north, which meant it was carrying their scent to me and not mine to them, and that told me something important. They didn't know that. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they hadn't learned to read wind on a planet that had been trying to kill people since before any of us were born. That was going to matter. Soon. I reached into the side pocket of my jacket and pulled out a piece of dried grass, the kind that grows tall and yellow along the old highway median, and put it between my teeth. It wasn't food, it never was. It was something to do with my mouth that wasn't talking and wasn't showing fear. Because fear has a smell too, and I had spent a long time learning not to make it. My father used to say that the moment you let an animal know you've seen it, the hunt changes. Before that moment, it's still deciding what you are. After that moment, it's decided. So you wait. You let it keep deciding for as long as you can stand it, because every second it spends deciding is a second it isn't acting. I didn't know what these 3 were deciding. I didn't know what they were, period. But I knew the shape of being hunted, the particular itch of it crawling up the back of my neck, and I had felt that itch enough times in my life to trust it completely. I turned down what used to be Cooper Street, toward the old reactor complex, and I didn't look back, and behind me, the wind shifted just slightly, and 3 sets of footsteps adjusted to follow. Good. The reactor town had been dead for longer than I'd been alive. Some kind of meltdown, some kind of evacuation, some kind of story that nobody alive anymore could tell with all the pieces in the right order. What was left was a square mile of broken buildings, a drainage canyon cut into the bedrock by decades of runoff, and enough twisted rebar and rusted machinery to build a maze that I had spent the better part of 2 years learning by heart. I knew where the ground was soft. I knew where the old coolant pits had been capped with sheet metal too thin to hold real weight. I knew which walls of the drainage cut were climbable and which ones only looked climbable, right up until you were 40 feet up and the rock came away in your hand like wet bread. I had walked this maze with snares and trip lines set for 2 days, because something had been killing the rabbits out past the tree line, leaving them too neat, too clean, no scavenger marks, the kind of clean that doesn't happen in nature. I'd known something was hunting out here before I ever saw a shape in the trees. I just hadn't known it would be hunting me. Now I did. I let my pace slow, just a little, just enough to look tired, just enough to look like prey that's been walking too long and is starting to feel it in its legs. It wasn't hard to fake. My legs actually were starting to feel it. Behind me, one of the shapes made a sound. Not a growl, not a snarl, something stranger than that, something with structure to it, rising and falling like a question being asked. Another shape answered, lower, shorter. They were talking. Of course they were talking. Things that hunt in formation usually can. I didn't understand a word of it, and I didn't need to. I understood the shape of the conversation just fine. One of them was asking whether it was safe to close the distance. One of them was telling it not yet. That told me they were being careful. Careful was useful information. Careful meant they had a reason to be careful, which meant somewhere, sometime, something on this miserable dirtball of a planet had taught them that caution was worth the trouble. I filed that away and kept walking. This wasn't the first time something with every advantage had decided I was worth the trouble. 2 winters ago it had been a pack of dogs gone wild, the kind that used to be somebody's pets before the world stopped having room for pets. I had learned that winter that the size of the thing chasing you matters less than the size of your nerve, and I had carried that lesson with me into every season since, folded up small and kept close, the way you keep a spare key somewhere you'll actually remember it. The reactor complex came into view, the cooling towers stained black at the top from some old fire, weeds growing waist-high through cracks in the access road. I angled toward the drainage cut instead of the main buildings, and I felt the formation behind me shift to match, and that was when I knew, for certain, that this wasn't going to end with me running and them losing interest. They wanted me in that canyon. They thought they were choosing it. I let them think that. The drainage cut narrowed as it ran deeper into the complex, walls climbing higher on either side, the bottom littered with decades of debris that had washed down during storms. Old fencing. A rusted shopping cart somehow, from a town with no store left standing. Sheets of corrugated metal half buried in silt. To anyone who hadn't spent 2 years walking this exact stretch of ground with a coil of fishing line over one shoulder, it looked like nothing. Junk. Garbage. The kind of place you'd walk through without a second thought. I had spent 11 days setting 6 snares through here. I knew where every one of them was. I knew which sections of ground had been packed solid by decades of rain, and which sections were nothing but a crust of dirt over a hollow pit that used to hold coolant tanks before someone, a long time ago, in a hurry, had pulled the tanks and never come back to fill the holes properly. I stepped exactly where I needed to step, the way you walk through your own kitchen in the dark, without thinking about it, because your feet already know. Behind me, the footsteps kept coming, closer now. Close enough that I could hear something else underneath the footfalls, a faint mechanical hum, like equipment running somewhere on their bodies, weapons maybe, or armor, or something I didn't have a word for, because nothing on earth needed a word for it until 11 minutes ago. I stopped walking when I reached the spot where the canyon narrowed to a single path between 2 walls of crumbling concrete, the place where, if I kept going another 30 feet, I would hit a dead end. A box canyon. The kind of trap that any hunter worth the name would recognize the second they saw it. The kind of trap that should have made all 3 of them stop and reconsider. The light was different in here, dimmer, filtered down through 2 stories of broken wall on either side, and the air carried that particular cold stillness that always settled over the deepest part of the canyon no matter what time of day you walked through it. I had noticed that stillness on my very first afternoon mapping this place, and I had decided somewhere in the back of my mind that it would make a good place to die if it ever came to that, simply because nobody would have to hear it happen. They didn't stop. I turned around slowly, hands loose at my sides, the grass stem still between my teeth, and got my first real look at the 3 things that had been following me for the better part of a mile. They were tall, taller than any person I'd ever stood next to, with proportions that were close enough to human to be unsettling rather than alien, the way a mask is more unsettling than a costume because it's almost a face and not quite one. Their skin had a faint gray sheen to it, like wet stone under cloud cover. Their eyes were too large and set slightly wrong, and all 3 of them were looking at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because I had seen it on the faces of men who thought they had the upper hand my entire life. It was the look of something that had already decided how this was going to end. The one in the middle, the tall one, the one who moved like he was used to being followed rather than following, stepped forward and said something in that rising, structured language, and this time I caught the shape of an actual question directed at me, even without understanding a word of it. I gave him nothing. I just looked back, chewing my piece of grass like I had absolutely nowhere better to be. That seemed to bother him more than running would have. The one on the left, the low, wide one, started circling toward the canyon wall on my right, cutting off an escape route I hadn't been planning to use anyway, since the only way out of this particular stretch of ground was the way they'd just walked me into. The one on the right, the watcher, stayed back near the canyon mouth, weapon raised but not aimed, the posture of something making sure nothing slipped past while the real work happened up front. 3 of them. 1 narrow canyon, 1 dead end 30 feet behind me, and 6 snares I had set with my own 2 hands over the past 11 days, scattered through this stretch of broken concrete and rusted metal, like a hand of cards I hadn't shown anyone yet. I crouched down, slow and unhurried, and unzipped the bag at my hip and started digging through it the way you'd dig through a bag looking for a lost set of keys. Dead batteries, a coil of fishing line, a folding knife with a chipped edge, nothing that looked like a threat, nothing that looked like anything at all. The tall one in the middle tilted his head, watching my hands instead of my face, and I understood, in that small motion, that he had made his first mistake. He thought the danger was in my bag. It wasn't. It was in the ground. The wide one on my right kept circling, boots crunching over loose gravel, and I let my eyes flick toward him just long enough to clock exactly where his next 3 steps were going to land. He was heavier than the other 2, built low and solid, and heavy things fall through thin ground faster than light things do. I had learned that lesson the hard way once, years ago, in a different stretch of broken concrete, and I had never needed to learn it twice. I zipped my bag back up and stood, slow, unhurried, the kind of slow that says I'm not a threat, and the kind of slow that's actually just patience wearing a disguise. The tall one in the middle watched me the whole time, head tilted at that same unsettling angle, and said something else in that rising, structured language. This time the watcher near the canyon mouth answered him, short and clipped, and I caught a single word repeated twice in both of their exchanges. A name, maybe. Or a rank. I filed the sound away without understanding it, the way you file away a stranger's accent before you know their language, just in case it ever becomes useful. I used the time their conversation bought me to look them over properly, the way I'd look over any animal I was about to share a small space with. Each of them wore some kind of dark harness across the chest, fitted close to the body, with small lights along one shoulder strap blinking in a slow, patient rhythm that never quickened no matter how close they got to me. That steadiness told me something. Whatever those lights were tracking, it wasn't worry. Their boots were heavier than mine, built for a different kind of ground than the cracked concrete under our feet, which explained why none of them moved with quite the same ease across this terrain that I did. Small things, small advantages. I had learned a long time ago that a fight is rarely won by the biggest difference between two opponents. It's won by whoever notices the smallest ones first. My father used to say that the second most dangerous thing you can do around a predator is run. The most dangerous thing is to let it believe you're harmless. I did neither. I stood there chewing my grass stem, watching the wide one circle, watching the tall one watch me, watching the watcher hang back near the mouth of the canyon with his weapon raised but not quite aimed, and I let all three of them keep deciding what I was for just a few more seconds, because every second they spent deciding was a second they weren't moving. The wide one finished his circle and stopped about 15 feet to my right, between me and the canyon wall, exactly where I had wanted him to stop, though he didn't know that, and I made very sure my face didn't tell him either. There was a patch of ground there that looked like every other patch of ground in this stretch of the canyon. Packed dirt, a scatter of broken concrete, a few tufts of dead grass pushing up through cracks. What it wasn't, underneath all that, was solid. It was the roof of an old coolant access pit, maybe 6 feet deep, capped decades ago with a sheet of corrugated metal that had been rusting quietly under a few inches of wind-blown dirt ever since. I had found it by accident on my third day mapping this canyon, when my own boot had punched through the edge of it and nearly taken my ankle with it. I had spent an afternoon after that making sure the center of it, right where a heavier man would naturally choose to stand for the best angle on a cornered target, was thinner than the edges. I hadn't built that trap for him specifically. I'd built it because something had been killing rabbits out past the tree line and I wanted whatever it was to fall somewhere I could find it again in the morning. Turned out the trap had better taste and timing than I did. The watcher near the canyon mouth hadn't moved from his spot, but something about his stance had changed in the last few seconds. A small shift of weight from his back foot to his front, the kind of shift that meant he was getting ready to move quickly if he needed to. I noticed it the same way I noticed everything else in that canyon, filing it away without letting my face show that I'd seen it, because the moment they realized I was reading them as carefully as they were reading me, the whole shape of this would change. I thought, for one strange second, about what my mother used to say before any of this. Before the world had narrowed down to canyons and snares and three gray shapes deciding whether I was worth their trouble. She used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is stand still when every part of them wants to run. I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now, standing with my back almost against a wall that wasn't going to hold much longer. 3 hunters closing around me with all the patience of something that has never once lost. I wondered, briefly, whether she would have recognized the woman standing in this canyon at all. The tall one took a step toward me, and another, closing the distance slow and deliberate, the way you close on something you've already won, when there's no hurry left in the situation, because the outcome is settled, and all that's left is the formality of finishing it. I knew that walk. I had seen men walk like that toward things that couldn't fight back, and I had promised myself a long time ago that I would never again be one of the things that couldn't fight back. I reached up and pulled the grass stem out of my mouth, slow, and let it drop to the ground between us, and said the first thing I'd said out loud since I clocked them in the tree line. I told him it was a nice canyon. It wasn't, really. It was a dead end full of rust and broken concrete and the bones of a building that had failed an entire town decades before I was born. But saying so out loud, calm and almost friendly, did something useful. It made the moment smaller. It took 3 towering hunters and a girl backed against a crumbling wall and turned it, for just a second, into something almost ordinary. 2 strangers making conversation. And ordinary things are harder to feel afraid of, even when you know better. He didn't understand me, obviously. None of them did. But something about the sound of a human voice, calm and unbothered, with 3 of them standing around her in a dead end with nowhere left to run, made the watcher near the mouth of the canyon shift his weight, just slightly, the kind of small motion that means a creature is recalculating something it thought it already knew. Good. Let him recalculate. Recalculating takes time. And time was the only thing I actually had on my side. The tall one didn't shift at all. He kept coming, weapon still lowered, like he didn't need it yet, like whatever they'd come here to do with me didn't require a weapon at the start of it, only at the end, and that thought sat in my stomach like a swallowed stone, cold and heavy, and not going anywhere. I took 1 step back, toward the dead end. toward the spot in the canyon floor where, 2 days ago, I had spent 4 hours on my hands and knees working a length of rusted rebar loose from a collapsed support wall, prying it free inch by inch until it sat in its socket held by nothing but its own weight and a thin crust of dried mud, balanced like a held breath, waiting for exactly the kind of pressure a body leaning back against that wall in a hurry would put on it. The tall one's eyes followed my retreat, and something in his posture eased, the particular ease of a predator watching prey do exactly what prey is supposed to do when it's out of room. He didn't know I'd run out of room 2 days before he ever showed up. The wide one shifted his weight off the patch of packed dirt and back onto solid ground, and for one terrible second I thought he'd noticed, thought some instinct in him had picked up on the wrongness underfoot the way mine would have, and the whole afternoon's work nearly went sideways in my chest before he simply turned his head to watch the tall one close the last of the distance, his attention pulled away from his own feet and onto me instead, because I was the show now, and nobody watches the ground when the show is standing right in front of them. I let my back find the canyon wall. I let my shoulders touch it, light, testing, just enough pressure to feel the give in the rebar behind the crumbling concrete, the faint shift of something that had been waiting 2 days to move. Not yet. The watcher near the canyon mouth said something short, sharp, a question this time, the rising tone unmistakable even across two completely different species, and two completely different ways of using a voice. The tall one answered without turning around, 3 clipped syllables, and whatever he said made the watcher lower his weapon another few degrees, made him relax into the posture of something that has stopped expecting trouble. That was the last mistake any of them were going to get to make for free. My heart was going hard enough now that I could feel it in my throat, and for one honest second, standing there with my back against a wall that was going to give way the moment I asked it to, I let myself wonder if I had miscounted something. 2 days of work, 6 snares, 1 length of rebar wedged loose in a wall, all of it built on the assumption that 3 hunters would walk exactly where I needed them to walk, exactly when I needed them to walk there. And assumptions, my father had always warned me, were the one luxury a trapper could never afford to lean on too hard. But the wide one was still standing on dirt that wasn't really dirt. The tall one was still closing the distance with his hand reaching for a shoulder that was about to not be where he expected it. The watcher was still hanging back at the mouth of a canyon that had stopped being an exit the moment I led them into it. Nothing had changed. The plan was still standing, even if my nerves were starting to wobble underneath it, and I made myself remember the difference between the two, because a wobble in your nerves is just weather. It passes. A plan that's already failed doesn't. I looked past the tall one, past his shoulder, at the wide one standing on a floor that wasn't really a floor, and at the watcher, standing at the mouth of a canyon I had spent 11 days turning into something other than a dead end, and I thought about my father's hands guiding mine over a snare wire, 20 years ago, in a kitchen that didn't exist anymore, in a country that barely existed anymore, teaching a girl who didn't yet know she'd need it that the animal that walks into the trap thinking it's the one in control is always, always, the animal that built the trap for somebody else. I had never built one for something like this. I was about to find out if it mattered. The tall one stopped, close now, close enough that I could see the texture of his gray skin, the strange, unblinking patience in his eyes, the faint mechanical hum coming from something mounted at his shoulder that I still didn't have a word for, and didn't need one for, because whatever it wasn't pointed at me yet, and that told me everything I needed to know about how much time I actually had left. Not much. He raised one hand, slow, almost gentle, the way you'd reach for something you didn't want to startle, and somewhere behind that gentleness was the same cold certainty I'd seen in every predator I'd ever stood in front of, the certainty of something that has already filed you under finished, and is only waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I let him reach. I let his hand close around empty air an inch from my shoulder, because I had already shifted my weight, already let my back press fully into the wall behind me, already felt the rebar groan under the pressure of 2 days of patient work finally being asked to do its job, and somewhere off to my right, under the wide one's planted feet, I heard the faintest sound a sheet of rusted metal makes in the half-second before it stops pretending to be solid ground. The tall one's hand closed on nothing, and his eyes followed mine, just slightly, just enough, toward the spot on the ground where his companion was standing. And in that half-second of him looking the wrong direction, I understood that the hunt, the real hunt, the one that actually mattered, was finally beginning. The ground gave first. Not a crack, not a warning, just a soft collapsing sigh, the sound dirt makes when it finally admits it was never holding anything up, and the wide one dropped straight down through the rusted metal sheet, like the canyon floor had simply changed its mind about existing under him. He didn't even have time to make a sound that meant anything. 1 second he was a shape standing 15 feet to my right, solid and sure of himself, and the next second he was gone to the shoulders, arms thrown wide, scrabbling at loose dirt that kept sliding down into the hole with him instead of holding his weight. The tall one's head snapped toward the sound, and that was the half-second I needed. I shoved off the canyon wall behind me with both hands, hard, all my weight behind it, and the rebar that had been sitting loose in its socket for 2 days finally let go of the last crust of dried mud holding it in place. It didn't fall slow. It came down fast and ugly, a length of rusted steel as thick as my wrist, swinging out from the crumbling wall it had been buried in, and it caught the tall one across the shoulder and the side of his head before he could finish turning to see what had made the noise behind him. He went down hard, onto one knee, one hand braced against the ground, and for the first time since I'd spotted him in the tree line, the cold certainty in his face cracked into something else, something closer to surprise, something closer to the look every predator gets in the half-second it realizes the thing it cornered was never actually cornered at all. I didn't wait to enjoy it. The watcher near the canyon mouth was already moving, weapon coming up fast now, no more hanging back, no more letting his companions handle the easy part while he watched the exit. He shouted something, sharp and urgent, the kind of sound that needs no translation because fear sounds the same in every language that's ever been spoken by anything with lungs. I dropped low and ran. Not away, not toward the dead end behind me, which wasn't really a dead end anymore, not with a length of rebar swinging loose and a wall half collapsed where it used to stand whole. I ran sideways, low and fast, toward the second snare line I'd strung 2 days earlier along the base of the canyon wall. A thin loop of fishing wire pulled taut between 2 iron stakes I'd driven 6 inches into packed dirt, invisible against the rubble unless you already knew exactly where to look. The watcher didn't know. His leading foot caught the wire at full stride, and his whole body kept moving forward at the speed he'd been running while his ankle suddenly wasn't allowed to anymore, and he went down in a sprawl of limbs and dropped weapon and a sound that was definitely not language anymore, just pure animal surprise. The universal noise every living thing makes in the half-second between standing and not standing. His weapon skittered across broken concrete and came to rest against a chunk of rubble, close enough that I could have reached it in 4 strides. I didn't go for it. A weapon I didn't understand, built for hands that weren't mine, calibrated for a body twice my size, was a worse bet than the ground I'd already spent 11 days learning by heart. My father used to say that a stranger's gun is just a heavy rock until you know how it works. And I had never once in my life trusted a heavy rock to save me faster than my own 2 feet could. I kept moving. Behind me, the wide one was still half buried in the coolant pit, twisting, trying to get an arm braced against the crumbling edge, and every time he found purchase, the dirt under that purchase gave way again, an ugly cycle of almost and not quite that was going to cost him minutes he didn't have. The tall one was back on his feet now, one hand pressed to the side of his head, swaying, blood the wrong color welling up dark between his fingers, and his eyes found mine across the canyon floor with an expression that had nothing left of patience in it. That was fine. I hadn't needed his patience. I'd needed his time, and I'd spent it well. The watcher rolled onto his back, ankle bent at an angle that made my own leg ache in sympathy even from a distance, and tried to push himself upright using his good leg, and I used the 3 seconds that took him to close the gap between us instead of waiting for him to close it on me, because waiting was a luxury built for people who weren't already running out of canyon. He saw me coming and got one arm up, defensive, too late, and I hit the back of his bad ankle with the flat of my boot. Not hard, just enough. Just exactly enough to fold the leg the wrong way and put him flat again, and then I was past him, moving toward the mouth of the canyon, toward open ground, toward anywhere that wasn't a dead end, with 2 wounded hunters, and 1 furious one still standing. I didn't make it 3 steps before something hit the wall beside my head hard enough to spray chips of concrete into my hair. And the sound that came with it, a flat, cracking snap like nothing I'd ever heard a weapon make before, told me the tall one had decided he was done being patient too. I dropped and rolled behind a chunk of collapsed wall, heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my teeth, and pressed my back against cold stone, and for the first time since the tree line, I let myself feel exactly how frightened I was. It didn't last long. It never did. Fear was useful for about 4 seconds, the 4 seconds where it sharpened everything, made the world go bright and loud and clear, and after that it just got in the way, and I had learned a long time ago, in a different kitchen, with a different set of hands not yet steady enough to set a snare correctly, that the trick wasn't getting rid of fear. The trick was using its 4 good seconds and throwing the rest of it away before it had the chance to use you instead. Another shot cracked into the wall above me, closer this time, and dust rained down into my hair, and somewhere behind that wall I heard the wide one finally haul himself free of the coolant pit with a wet, scraping sound I decided very firmly not to think about. and the watcher dragging himself across broken concrete on one good leg and two arms, weapon abandoned, voice raised in something that wasn't language anymore either. Just pain finding the shortest distance to a sound. Two of them were down, not gone. There's a difference, and I knew it better than most people ever needed to. Because down things get back up, and the only thing more dangerous than a predator that's never been hurt is a predator that has just learned, for the first time in its life, that it can be. I risked a look around the edge of the wall. The tall one stood in the center of the canyon floor, weapon raised properly now, both hands steady despite the blood still running from the side of his head, and his eyes swept the rubble field with a precision that told me whatever fear had cracked through his certainty a minute ago had already been filed away and locked behind something colder. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. He wasn't going to walk toward me slow and certain anymore. He was hunting now, properly, the way I imagined his kind had hunted 100 worlds before this one, careful and patient and absolutely without mercy. I had 4 more snares between here and the canyon mouth. He had a weapon that could turn solid stone into gravel from 30 feet away. It wasn't an even trade. It had never been an even trade. My father used to say that the deer never has the advantage, not really, not against a rifle, and the only thing the deer has that the hunter doesn't is knowing the ground better than anyone who's only walked it twice. I had walked this canyon for 2 years. I had set these snares with my own hands. I knew which patches of dirt would hold a body's weight and which ones would swallow it whole, and the tall one, for all his weapon and his certainty and his cold, patient eyes, did not. That was the only edge I had left. It was going to have to be enough. I moved low along the base of the wall, away from the rubble pile that had just taken 2 shots meant for my head, toward the next stretch of canyon floor where a length of fishing wire sat strung ankle-high between 2 stakes I'd driven the week before. And behind me, I heard footsteps, deliberate, unhurried now, the footsteps of something that had stopped chasing and started stalking instead, and somewhere underneath the cold, clear focus that fear's 4 good seconds had carved into me, I understood, with absolute certainty, that whatever happened in the next few minutes, only one of us was walking out of this canyon standing up. I intended for it to be me. The wide one was up now, favoring one leg. Dirt and rust streaked down one whole side of his body, and he'd found his footing near the coolant pit, and was moving to flank wide around the rubble field instead of through it. Smart, careful, the kind of careful that told me he'd already learned the lesson I'd been hoping to teach. I couldn't let him circle. A flank meant 2 angles of attack instead of 1, and 2 angles of attack meant there was no piece of cover in this whole canyon that would keep me out of someone's line of fire for more than a few seconds at a time. I needed him to stay where he was, or better yet, I needed him to stop being a problem entirely, and I had exactly one more idea for how to manage that. Sitting 15 feet away, tangled in a coil of wire I'd left looped loosely around a fallen support beam, in case the first snare didn't do its job alone. Getting to it meant crossing open ground in full view of a hunter with a weapon that could turn stone to gravel. I went anyway, because staying still was its own kind of dying, just slower, and at least moving gave me a chance the standing still didn't. The crack of the weapon firing came half a second after I'd already started moving, which meant it missed, which meant I'd guessed his timing right, and I hit the fallen support beam at a dead run, and dropped behind it just as a second shot chewed a divot out of the concrete 6 inches from where my head had been a heartbeat earlier. My hands found the loose coil of wire without my eyes needing to help them. Some things, once your body learns them, it never forgets. The way you don't have to look at your own hands to tie a knot you've tied 1,000 times before in the dark, in the cold, with fingers too numb to feel what they were doing, and doing it right anyway because the doing had stopped being a decision a long time ago. I looped the wire twice around the base of the beam, anchored it, and ran the rest of the length out low across the open ground, toward the spot where the wide one's flanking path would have to cross if he wanted the angle he was after, and I had maybe 10 seconds to finish the job before he reached it. 10 seconds that felt like they were made of glass, thin and sharp and ready to shatter the moment I asked too much of them. I made it with 2 seconds to spare. He came around the rubble field exactly where I'd guessed he would, moving fast despite the limp, weapon up, eyes scanning for an angle on me instead of watching his own feet. Because by now his attention belonged entirely to the tall one's hunt, and not to his own, and the wire caught him mid-stride, and snapped taut around both ankles at once. He went down sideways into the rubble, hard, and didn't get back up right away, and somewhere in the fall his weapon discharged into the canyon wall above his head, a wild shot that went nowhere near me, just noise and dust, and one more piece of broken stone added to a canyon floor that was quickly turning into nothing but broken stone. That left 2 of them down, properly down now, the kind of down that wasn't getting up again in the next 60 seconds even if it wanted to, and one of them still standing in the center of the canyon, with blood drying dark along the side of his face, and a weapon that hadn't missed by much either time he'd fired it. I crouched behind the fallen support beam and tried to slow my breathing, tried to find the 4 good seconds of clarity fear had given me at the start of all this, and stretch them into something that would last a little longer, because the easy part, if any of this could be called easy, was over. The wide one and the watcher had been obstacles, things to get past, traps to spring, problems with solutions I'd already worked out 2 days before either of them ever stepped into this canyon. The tall one was not an obstacle. The tall one was the hunt itself, distilled down into one furious, wounded, fully focused predator who had just watched both of his companions go down to a girl half his size with nothing but wire and rust and patience, and who was, I had no doubt at all, done underestimating me. I heard him moving through the rubble, unhurried now despite everything, footsteps deliberate, the sound of something that had stopped expecting an easy ending and had started, instead, respecting exactly how much this was going to cost him. There was no 4th snare close enough to use. I'd set the last 2 further down the canyon, near the mouth, and getting to them meant crossing ground he could see clearly from where he stood, ground with no cover wide enough to hide behind for more than a few seconds at a stretch. I looked at the rebar still hanging loose from the broken wall behind me, at the coolant pit gaping open where the wide one had fallen through, at the coil of wire still looped around the fallen support beam with maybe 8 feet of slack left unused, and I understood, with the particular cold clarity that only ever shows up when there's genuinely nothing left to lose, that whatever I did in the next 60 seconds, I was going to have to do it with my own 2 hands, close enough to see the wrongness of his eyes, close enough that there would be no ground left between us to hide behind, no snare clever enough to do the work for me. Nothing left of 2 years of careful planning, except whatever I had actually learned how to do with my own body when the planning ran out. The footsteps stopped. I risked a look around the edge of the beam, and found him standing maybe 20 feet away, weapon lowered now, not because he'd given up on it, but because he'd decided, somewhere in the last 60 seconds, that this had stopped being something a weapon was going to settle. His eyes found mine across the rubble, steady, cold, patient in a way that had nothing left of the easy certainty he'd walked into this canyon with, and something passed between us in that long silent moment that didn't need any language at all to translate. He understood, finally, exactly what kind of animal he'd cornered. I understood, just as clearly, that understanding wasn't going to make him stop. He came at me fast, faster than his earlier walk had suggested he could move, closing the 20 feet between us in a handful of long strides, and I had just enough time to grab the loose coil of wire off the fallen support beam before he was on me. I didn't try to fight him straight on. He had reach on me, weight on me, and whatever strength ran through a body built for a heavier gravity than this one, and standing still and trading blows with something like that was the fastest way I knew to lose. So I didn't stand still. I let him close the last few feet expecting me to plant my feet and brace, and instead I dropped low and went sideways, past his reaching arm, in toward his body where his longer limbs couldn't get the leverage they wanted. He recovered fast, faster than I expected, and his other hand swept down toward me in a wide arc that would have caught me square across the side of the head if I hadn't already been moving past him, close enough now that I could feel the heat coming off his harness, and hear, up close, that the steady blinking lights along his shoulder strap had finally stopped being steady. They were flashing now, quick and erratic, some kind of warning I couldn't read and didn't need to, because I could feel the same warning in my own chest without any device at all to tell me about it. His hand caught my shoulder anyway, just barely, just enough to spin me half around, and pain bloomed bright and immediate down my arm, the kind of pain that tells you something is going to bruise badly tomorrow, and you don't have time to think about tomorrow right now. I rode the spin instead of fighting it, used the momentum to put myself behind him for half a second, and looped the wire in my hands around his nearest wrist before he'd finished turning to find me again. It wasn't going to hold him. Wire that thin wasn't built to hold something his size, not for more than a few seconds, but a few seconds was all I needed, because behind him, 6 feet away, the canyon floor dropped into the open mouth of the coolant pit his companion had fallen through 20 minutes earlier, and a few seconds of off-balance stumbling in the wrong direction was worth more to me right now than any weapon I didn't know how to use. He felt the wire bite and wrenched his arm forward, hard, trying to throw me off, and I let go on purpose, let the momentum carry me backward instead of fighting it, and used the half second that bought me to plant both feet and shove, with everything I had, square into his chest. It wasn't a strong shove. I knew that even as I made it. Against something his size it should have done nothing at all, Should have been like pushing against a wall and getting nowhere for the effort. But he was already off balance, already mid-stride with one foot still tangled loosely in wire, already carrying forward momentum from his own attack that had nowhere left to go but down, and a small shove in exactly the right direction, at exactly the right moment, is sometimes worth more than a much bigger one thrown anywhere else. He went backward, his heel caught the crumbling lip of the coolant pit, and for one long suspended second his arms windmilled, reaching for balance that wasn't there anymore, his eyes wide with something that finally looked like fear instead of certainty. And then he was gone, down into the dark of the pit with a heavy, ugly sound that I didn't watch closely enough to describe, because I was already turning away, already moving, because a fall like that doesn't end a fight on its own, and I had learned a long time ago never to assume it had. I grabbed a fist-sized chunk of broken concrete off the ground, the only weapon within reach that didn't require understanding how it worked, and went to the edge of the pit ready to use it, and found him at the bottom, 6 feet down, one leg bent under him at an angle that told me, even without any medical training at all, that he wasn't getting back up in a hurry. He looked up at me, blood still dark along the side of his face, breathing hard, one hand pressed flat against the dirt wall of the pit like he was trying to find something solid to hold on to in a world that had just stopped making sense to him. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say that either of us would have understood, and besides, my hands were shaking now, the cold, clear focus that fear's 4 good seconds had given me finally running out, leaving behind something messier and harder to name, something that wanted very badly to sit down on the ground and not get up again for a while. I didn't let it, not yet. There would be time for that later, alone, somewhere quiet, where nobody needed me steady, and nothing needed me sharp, and I could let the shaking finish whatever it had started, without an audience to watch it happen. But not here. Not yet. Here, 3 hunters who had walked into this canyon certain of how the afternoon would end, were still close enough to change their minds about being finished, and a girl who let her guard down a minute too early was a girl who didn't get to walk back out of the canyon at all. I stepped back from the edge of the pit, chunk of concrete still gripped tight in one fist, and made myself breathe, slow, the way my father had taught me a lifetime ago in a kitchen that didn't exist anymore. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, until the shaking in my hands settled into something I could work with, instead of something working against me. Behind me, somewhere in the rubble field, I could hear the watcher still struggling against the wire around his ankles, his voice raised in a thin, exhausted sound that had given up entirely on being threatening. The wide one had gone quiet, slumped against the canyon wall where he'd fallen, conscious but clearly past the point of doing anything more dangerous than watching. 3 of them, all 3 of them down, in one canyon, on one afternoon, because a girl they'd decided wasn't worth their caution had spent 11 days deciding the exact opposite about them. I walked over to the watcher first, slow, the concrete still in my hand, and stood over him while he stopped struggling against the wire and went very still, watching me with both hands raised in a gesture that needed no translation at all. I didn't touch him. I just looked at the wire wrapped tight around his ankles, made sure it was going to hold for as long as I needed it to, and stepped back. He could work himself free eventually, given enough time and enough patience, and that was fine. I wasn't trying to keep him there forever. I just needed enough of a head start that none of this would be following me home. The wide one watched me approach with the wary stillness of something that had already decided fighting wasn't worth the trouble anymore, slumped against the canyon wall with one leg held awkward and one arm wrapped around his middle, and when I crouched in front of him, close enough that he could have reached me if he'd wanted to, he didn't move at all. I don't know what I expected to feel, standing that close to something that had walked into these woods planning to end me. Anger, maybe, or satisfaction. What I actually felt was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of tired recognition, the same thing you feel looking at a dog that bit you because it was scared, not because it was cruel. It didn't make what he'd come here to do forgivable. It just made it smaller, somehow, less like a monster and more like a mistake that had cost him everything. I crouched at the lip of the pit again, looking down at the tall one, who had stopped trying to climb and was simply watching me now, breathing hard, blood drying along his jaw, eyes carrying an expression I understood perfectly, even across every difference our 2 species had ever had between them. It was the look of something realizing for the very first time exactly how small it actually was. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Pity is a strange thing to feel standing over something that came to your world to hunt you for sport, and I turned it over in my mind for a moment, the way you'd turn over a stone to see what's underneath, before I set it down and let it go. Sorry wasn't going to change anything about what had happened in this canyon, and it certainly wasn't going to change what would have happened to me if our positions had been reversed. I had learned, a long time ago, that feeling something, and acting on it, were two entirely different choices, and I had already made mine the moment I started setting snares. There was a stretch of ground a long way from here and a long time ago, a kitchen with peeling wallpaper and a window that didn't quite latch, a man who had taught a girl how to read wind and set wire, and trust the 4 good seconds fear gave you before it turned into something useless. And I had buried that man with my own 2 hands in ground that had since been swallowed by exactly the kind of dead reactor town I was standing in now, and I had spent every year since then turning his lessons into the only inheritance I had left, the only blood money worth spending. I remembered, standing there with rust on my hands and a stranger's blood drying somewhere on a length of wire I'd left behind in the rubble, the very first snare he ever showed me how to tie. I had been 7 years old, fingers too small and too clumsy for the wire, and I'd cried out of frustration when the loop kept slipping loose no matter how many times I tried it, and he hadn't told me to stop crying. He'd just taken my hands in his, gently, and walked me through it again, slower, and said that the wire didn't care how I felt about it. It only cared whether I did it right. I hadn't understood, at 7, why that was supposed to be comforting. I understood it now, every single time my hands found steady ground in the middle of something that should have broken them. I didn't explain any of that to the thing in the pit. There wasn't a version of that story short enough to tell while standing over something that had come here to end mine, and there wasn't a version of it that he'd have understood anyway. And besides, some things don't get explained. Some things just get carried, quiet and unspoken, until the moment they decide to surface on their own, and this wasn't that moment. I straightened up, dropped the chunk of concrete, and looked around the canyon floor at the wreckage of an afternoon that had started with me noticing 3 shapes in a tree line, and was ending with all 3 of those shapes broken in a maze I'd spent 2 years learning by heart. Somewhere near the fallen support beam, half buried in dust, my grass stem lay where I'd dropped it at the start of all this. I walked over, picked it back up, brushed it off against my sleeve, and put it back between my teeth. It tasted like dust and rust, and the particular bitterness of surviving something that should have killed me, and I chewed it anyway, slow, unhurried, the way you chew on something when your hands have finally stopped shaking and your mind hasn't quite caught up to the rest of you yet. I didn't know, standing there, that the tall one wasn't finished. I didn't know that somewhere on his body, under torn clothing and gray skin gone pale with shock, a small device was already burning through the last of its power reserve, sending a final, garbled burst of data back towards something far above the clouds that none of us on the ground had ever been meant to see. I wouldn't learn about that device or what it had been sending, or who on the other end of that transmission had been waiting to receive it, for weeks yet, and on that afternoon, walking away from a canyon full of broken hunters with rust on my hands and a piece of dried grass between my teeth, I had no reason at all to think that this was anything other than finished. I just knew that I was alive, and they weren't standing anymore, and that for now, in this canyon, on this afternoon, that was going to have to be enough. I turned and started walking out of the dead reactor town, leaving 3 broken hunters behind me in the dirt, and I didn't look back. Because my father had taught me that too, a long time ago, in a kitchen that didn't exist anymore. You don't look back at a trap once it's already done its work. You let it sit there, quiet, and you go on living. It took me 4 days to walk back to anywhere that still had people in it, and by the time I reached the settlement at Holloway Bend, my shoulder had turned the color of a thundercloud, and I had stopped flinching every time a bird moved in the brush beside the road. That's the thing nobody tells you about surviving something. The fear doesn't leave all at once. It leaks out slowly, over days, in small doses, until one morning you wake up and realize you slept through the night, without once reaching for the knife under your pillow. Holloway Bend wasn't much, a cluster of repaired buildings around an old crossroads, a well that still pulled clean water, and maybe 60 people who had decided, at some point or another, that this particular stretch of ground was worth defending instead of leaving. I had grown up at its edges, close enough to trade and far enough to be left alone. And walking back into it after 4 days on the road felt the way it always did, like stepping out of cold water into something that almost remembered how to be warm. I didn't tell anyone in Holloway Bend what had happened in the reactor town, not because it was a secret exactly, but because there wasn't a short way to say it, and the long way wasn't something I had the words for yet. I told Grace, who ran the trading post and had known my father back when he was still alive to know anybody, that I'd had a rough few days out past the tree line, and she looked at my shoulder and my eyes and didn't ask any more questions than that, because Grace had buried enough people of her own to know the particular shape of a question nobody once answered. I would have let it stay that way. I would have gone right back to scouting salvage routes and setting snares and chewing dead grass between my teeth like nothing in the world had changed. Except that 9 days after I walked out of that canyon, a man named Caleb showed up at the trading post asking for me by name. I didn't know him. He knew exactly who I was. Grace watched him sit down across from me with the particular narrowed look she reserved for strangers who knew more about her customers than she did, and after he left that first evening, she found me out by the well, pumping water I didn't really need, just to have something to do with my hands. She asked if I was going to go with him next time he came through, join whatever it was he was part of, and I told her I didn't know yet. She nodded slowly, the way she did when she was deciding whether to say something she'd been holding back, and then she told me that my father had spent the last few years of his life listening to a radio not so different from Caleb's, late at night, after I'd gone to sleep, trying to make sense of patterns he never explained to her either. I had never known that. It sat strange in my chest for days afterward, the idea that he might have been listening for the exact same thing, years before I ever found a reason to. He sat across from me at Grace's back table with a battered radio receiver wrapped in a canvas satchel, the kind of equipment that didn't exist anymore unless someone had spent years keeping it alive on spare parts and stubbornness, and told me, in a low, careful voice, that there was a network of people scattered across what used to be 6 different states. Listening posts mostly, old radio operators and a few people who'd gotten their hands on stranger equipment than that, all of them quietly tracking something they called guild traffic, the chatter that moved between the things that came down out of the sky to hunt on a planet most of them weren't supposed to be hunting on at all. He told me the network had started almost 20 years ago, long before I was old enough to understand any of this, with a handful of survivors who'd noticed the same thing I'd noticed in the rabbits out past the tree line. Kills that were too clean, too neat, the kind of clean that doesn't happen in nature. They had started listening before they had any idea what they were listening for, and over the years they had built, piece by piece, person by person, a rough picture of something most of the world still didn't believe existed. A quiet hunting trade that treated Earth as a testing ground, a place where younger hunters proved themselves against something the rest of the guild considered beneath serious attention. He said my name had come up in that traffic. I asked him what that meant, and he turned the receiver on, and for the first time in my life I heard the sound of a language I'd already heard once before, rising and falling in that same structured way, except this time it came with a translation running underneath it, in a flat, careful voice that Caleb said belonged to a woman 3 counties over, who'd spent 15 years teaching herself to read patterns in a language nobody human was ever supposed to need. The recording was a transmission burst, garbled in places, fragments missing, the kind of thing you'd expect from a device that had been damaged and was running on whatever power it had left. But what survived was enough. A voice identifying itself as Hunt Captain Skarn, reporting status from a ground engagement on what the recording called the Deathworld designation pending world. 2 confirmed casualties among hunting personnel, identified in the fragments as Vey and Orth, both listed as incapacitated, condition uncertain at time of transmission. Terrain anomalies inconsistent with natural formation, the recording said, a careful, clinical phrase that I understood, sitting at that back table with my shoulder still aching, to mean somebody finally noticing that the ground itself had been turned against them. And then, near the end, garbled badly, breaking apart into static, a final fragment that the woman 3 counties over had apparently spent a long time piecing back together from half a dozen overlapping transmissions, because the words mattered enough to somebody, somewhere, that it had been worth the trouble. Recommend Deathworld designation be upgraded from caution to avoidance. Caleb turned the receiver off and let the silence sit there for a while before he said anything else, and when he finally spoke, he told me that the file Hunt Captain Skarn had been transmitting was supposed to be a routine engagement report, the kind every hunting party filed after a confirmed kill or a confirmed retreat. 1 page of clinical summary meant to close out the mission and clear the way for the next one. There was supposed to be a second page, every report like it had one, a medical assessment, filed by whoever processed the wounded once a hunting party made it back to wherever hunting parties went when they were done with a world. Casualties, injuries, recovery timelines, the boring administrative paperwork that turns a fight into a filing cabinet entry. The network had been listening to guild traffic for going on 6 years by the time Caleb sat down across from me, and in all that time, he said, they had never once seen a report come back from this particular hunting guild without that second page attached. This one didn't have one. Nobody, as far as the network had ever been able to determine, had filed it, not because the information didn't exist, but because, according to a much later fragment the woman 3 counties over had managed to piece together from an entirely different transmission weeks afterward, the administrator originally assigned to process the medical assessment had requested reassignment before finishing it, and the administrator assigned after that had requested the same thing, and at some point, far above any level of the guild that anybody on Earth would ever get to see, somebody had simply decided that page 1 was complete enough on its own, and closed the file. I asked Caleb what happened to Hunt Captain Scarn. He said the records listed his status as unconfirmed, and that unconfirmed, in 6 years of listening to this particular kind of traffic, was a status the network had only ever seen attached to a small handful of names, and that every single one of those names had, as far as anyone could tell, simply stopped appearing in any later transmission at all. No follow-up, no closure, just a word sitting alone in a file, doing the work that an entire second page apparently couldn't bring itself to do. They and Orth, the network had learned through a separate fragment weeks later, had not received that same silence. Their cases had closed normally, processed and filed the ordinary way. 2 more names added to a long, quiet record of hunters who had returned from the Deathworld pending world with injuries and a story they apparently weren't eager to repeat. Caleb said the woman 3 counties over had found, in a much smaller fragment buried inside a much larger transmission, a single line attributed to one of the 2 that the translation software had rendered, as best as it could, into something close to Refuse's further Deathworld assignment. I didn't know which of them had said it. I found, sitting at that table, that I didn't especially need to. I sat with that for a long time after Caleb packed his radio back into its satchel and left, walking the long road out of Holloway Bend toward whatever listening post came next on whatever route he was running. I thought about the tall one's eyes at the bottom of that pit, the particular look of something realizing how small it actually was, and I thought about a kitchen that didn't exist anymore, and a man who had taught me to read wind and set wire, and I thought, more than anything else, about how strange it was that somewhere, on a world I would never see, in a language I would never speak, there was a piece of paperwork sitting unfinished, because the people responsible for finishing it couldn't make themselves do it. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I want to be honest about that part, because it would be easy to end this story with some kind of satisfaction, some kind of clean victory lap, and that isn't what it felt like, sitting at Grace's back table with my shoulder still healing, and a stranger's translated voice still echoing in my ears. What it felt like, more than anything, was the particular kind of tired that doesn't have a bottom to it, the kind that doesn't go away with sleep because it was never really about the body in the first place. I had survived something that should have killed me, and instead of feeling lighter for it, I felt like I was carrying something new, something with weight and shape that hadn't been there before Caleb sat down with his battered radio, and I didn't yet have a name for what that something was. I still don't, fully. I've stopped trying to force one onto it. It felt like something had been let loose into the world that I hadn't fully understood when I set those 6 snares in a dead reactor town. Something bigger than 3 hunters and 1 canyon, something that was going to keep moving long after I stopped thinking about it. The way a stone thrown into still water keeps moving long after the hand that threw it has gone back to whatever it was doing before. Word spreads, even across the distance between stars, even through guilds and filing systems and administrators who didn't want to be the ones to write the final line. Word spreads the way it always has, slow and quiet and unstoppable, and somewhere out past the clouds, on worlds I will never see, populated by things I will never meet, there are hunters now who have heard the words Deathworld designation upgraded to avoidance, and have decided, on the strength of 1 unfinished report and 1 missing second page, that this particular blue and broken planet is not worth the trouble it costs to hunt. Caleb came back through Holloway Bend twice more over the following year, and each time he brought a little more of the picture with him. Other listening posts had picked up fragments of the same story, retold in different ways by different voices, the details shifting slightly with each retelling, the way stories always do once they leave the hands of the person who actually lived them. In one version, I had set 100 snares instead of 6. In another, there had been 5 hunters in that canyon instead of 3. I let those versions exist without correcting them, partly because there was no way to reach whoever was telling them, and partly because I had started to understand that the story wasn't really about me anymore. It had become a piece of caution passed quietly between worlds, the kind of thing told to young hunters before their first assignment, and if a little exaggeration kept more of them from coming, I decided I could live with that. I still walk the salvage routes. I still set snares when something starts killing the rabbits out past the tree line, and I still carry a piece of dried grass in my jacket pocket, though I notice, now, that I reach for it more often than I used to, in moments that have nothing to do with hunters at all, just quiet moments, ordinary moments, the kind where my hands need something to do that isn't shaking. I never went back to that reactor town. I never needed to know, for certain, what happened to the 3 shapes I left behind in that canyon, and some nights, lying awake under a roof that mostly still keeps the rain out, I find myself glad of that, glad of the not knowing, glad that some stories get to end with an unconfirmed status instead of a closing line, because a closing line means somebody had to write it, and I have come to understand, slowly, over the months since Caleb sat down across from me with his battered radio, that some things are better left as an empty page. Some mornings I still wake up reaching for the knife under my pillow before I remember where I am, and some mornings I don't reach for it at all, and I've stopped trying to predict which kind of morning it's going to be before my feet hit the floor. That unpredictability used to scare me. Now I mostly just let it be what it is, a small unfinished thing living quietly alongside everything else I carry. The same way a snare sits patient in the ground long after the trapper has walked away and gone home to sleep. Somewhere, filed away in a system built by people who will never set foot on this planet, in a language no human mouth was built to speak, there is a report with my name nowhere written on it, and one page of clinical, careful detail, and a second page that has stayed blank for longer than anyone responsible for filling it has been willing to explain. I like to think it stays that way. I like to think that somewhere, in some quiet office on some world I will never see, that blank page sits in its file like a held breath, like a wire pulled taut and waiting, like a piece of dried grass chewed slow and unhurried by somebody who has learned, the hard way, that the most dangerous thing in any hunt has never once been the size of the predator. It has always been the patience of the thing it cornered.